Essential question 2 is what were the legal and material constraints on slaves' lives and work? Slaves were legally defined as property. In fact, they were legally defined as what was called chattel property. And chattel property referred to really movable property rather than unmovable property such as land or a home. For example, for insurance purposes at the time, things like furniture would also have been considered to be chattel property. But as slaves were defined legally as property, they found no real protection under the law because they were considered things legally rather than people. Free African Americans, also in the South, had very few legal protections as well. And we should, of course, remember that first and foremost, slavery was a labor system. The work for slaves varied. Some work was skilled, some was unskilled, some was domestic, some was agricultural, but most slaves were engaged in agricultural work, say gang labor for cotton or task labor to harvest rice and so on. Some slaves would actually work in the city and be hired out by their owners, and those slaves that worked in the city tended to have more freedom because they tended to have more unsupervised time. Finally, a major constraint on the lives of slaves was physical abuse, which was extremely common. Physical abuse was extremely common, and its intent was to maintain order and control. The arbitrary use of physical abuse is a way of keeping an entire population of people subjugated. And I should also add that sexual abuse was likewise very common. And many female slaves, through at some point in their life, were subject to sexual abuse or rape. Abuse for slaves was more common for what were called house slaves, or slaves that worked in domestic labor within the household, and that's because they were constantly supervised and were very close to their owners who would give out that abuse.